I am so delighted to welcome you all to the launch for Zachary Levenson's book, Delivery as Dispossession, Land Occupation and Eviction in the Post-Apartheid City, published by Oxford University Press. My name is Gowri Vijayakumar. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Brandeis University, and I have the great honor and joy of moderating this celebration of Zach's book. So before I do anything else, I'm going to commodify knowledge for a second and put a link to the book in the chat, along with a discount code that will get you 30% off. So please check that out. Books take a long time to write. The fieldwork for the book we're here to discuss today took more than a decade. So what I hope we can do with this time we have together today, and it's an hour and a half, not 3 hours in case you were misled by the invitation, is to not only discuss and debate the arguments of the book, but to celebrate the achievement this book represents. So to that end, I'd like to ask that you make sure your audio is muted unless you're actively speaking, just to avoid background noise. If you feel comfortable, please do turn your video on so that Zach can see your faces. We are recording this event, so if that affects your comfort level with your video on, that's just a note for you. And please do feel free to use the chat to add comments or thoughts as the discussion progresses. We do have about 30 minutes for a discussion at the end, but we won't probably have a chance to hear from everyone. So if you have reactions, feel free to share them in the chat. What I'll do now is briefly introduce and summarize the book. And the goal is basically to make sure that those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book yet have some sense of what it contains. Of course, when I very overconfidently offered to summarize this book, I hadn't realized how hard it would be to briefly distill this very elegant analysis that Zach performs in this book, but I'm going to do my best. And of course, Zach will have the chance to correct me at the end when he responds. So after I introduce the book, we'll hear from each of our distinguished commentators, and then Zach will have some time to respond to their comments, and then we will open it up to all of you with your thoughts and questions. Delivery as Dispossession is a historical and ethnographic study of housing delivery and land occupation in post-apartheid South Africa, specifically in the township of Mitchell's Plain in the Cape Flats area of Cape Town. More generally, the book develops Zach's relational theory of the state, built on his extension of what Gramsci called the integral state. So first, why is housing delivery such an important site for studying the state? The post-apartheid regime saw housing delivery as central to its project of liberatory material redistribution. As Zach shows us, its legitimacy depended on delivering housing, and it was in fact able to distribute free formal housing at quite a massive scale. But in the context of rapid migration of Black South Africans to cities in the post-apartheid era, demand has far outstripped supply. So this has meant a backlog in housing that Zach says is estimated to be between 2.1 and 2.7 million. In the absence of housing, the residents Zach studies occupy land, both privately and publicly owned, in what Asif Bayat might call the quiet encroachment of the ordinary. These occupations pose a threat to housing officials who see them as threatening the democratic and orderly distribution of formal housing, or as many of the housing officials call it, queue jumping. This means that in order to do what they believe they must do to secure housing delivery, paradoxically, the state must evict people who are occupying land for basic survival. So the central question of Zach's book then is how the process of eviction occurs, why it occurs when it does, and what that can tell us about the operation of the state. At the heart of the book is the relationship between the state, so in this case, housing officials, and residents, in this case, the occupiers of land. So Zach compares two land occupations, one that was evicted and one that was not. But what's novel about this approach is that it's not just a resource mobilization analysis comparing one movement's success and another's failure. Instead, Zach takes a dialectical approach to the relationship between these land occupations and the state as sort of mutually constituting each other. He traces this difference to how residents and the state see each other. So in Captain's Clip, residents see the state as a partner in delivery, and they work in atomized, individualistic ways to secure housing. But when their eviction case enters the courts, the judge sees them as factionalized, opportunistic, and undeserving, and they end up being evicted. In Sakalo, residents see the state in a more antagonistic way and organize through representative leadership within the occupation. When their case enters the court, the judge sees them as a unified group of deserving residents, and they are allowed to remain. So this might seem paradoxical. The residents who see the state as a partner end up getting evicted, and the ones who antagonize it do not. But Zach's analysis is attuned to unintended consequences. So neither group explicitly intends to target the state. They are articulating their interests on the terrain of civil society. But Zach argues, following Gramsci's theory of the integral state, that this civil society articulation is also a political society articulation. It must play out on the state's terms, in this case, in the courts. So I also just want to point out a kind of historical argument that Zach makes here. And I'll preface this by saying that one thing I remember from talking to Zach about the title of the book early on is the relationship between dispossession and delivery. So I remember a conversation about whether it should be delivery and dispossession, delivery through dispossession, or Zach's idea of a title, Deliver Us from Evil. A standard account would say that the apartheid state dispossessed and the post-apartheid state delivered. So the apartheid state appropriated people's material resources, and then the post-apartheid state provided them. But what Zach shows us is that delivery and dispossession are inextricably linked. It's only that their configuration changes. So the apartheid regime built houses in order to enable dispossession, and the post-apartheid regime dispossesses people in order to enable delivery. So Zach is letting go here of a kind of binary opposition between the apartheid and post-apartheid regimes, and allowing us to think through how both dispossession and delivery, or more generally kind of violence and redistribution, operate within both state regimes. So this is, of course, as you can tell, a complex and layered argument that we will have time to delve into in the discussion that follows. But before that, I just wanted to say a few more overarching words about the book. This is a sharp, theoretically complex, and brilliant book. Scholars have called it path-breaking, fresh, and tightly argued, particularly for its relational understanding of how poor and working-class people and the state engage with each other. Perhaps one of the most powerful underlying premises of the book is that the poor are not simply unorganized masses who operate outside of the realm of politics, but in fact, they mutually constitute state practices and outcomes. The book is exhaustively, and I think I can say this because you're my friend, exhaustingly rigorous, perhaps most evident in the prolific footnotes in which you can find everything from not so oblique critiques of Laclau and Move to histories of the Black consciousness movement, to reviews of the literature on eviction in India and Brazil, to detailed expositions of Bourdieusian and Foucauldian accounts of the state. The book is ethnographic, but offers a novel approach to what Zach calls ethnography at a distance. He triangulates sources, diaries from occupiers, film footage, archival documents, and interviews with housing officials, in addition to participant observation. I'll also say that the note on data and methods itself is a novel contribution to the genre. Zach talks here about what he describes as being a 6'2" white man taking notes in the corner, but he avoids hand-wringing about his privilege or claiming any kind of radical authenticity. Instead, building on Michael Buravoy's approach to reactivity, Zach discusses what he calls an ethical reactivity, attention to the effects of ethnographic work on the political life and work of his interlocutors. The book is clearly built on long and meaningful relationships and friendships, but what's also clear is that he shows us a kind of ethical political orientation to the ethnographic endeavor, in which he's not only an analyst, but a comrade in struggle. There's much more to say, of course, so I'm now going to turn it over to our speakers, and I'm going to first introduce them all and then turn it to each one of them in turn. So Javier Auyero will be our first speaker. He's the Joe R. and Teresa Lozano Long Professor in Latin American Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. His main areas of research, writing, and teaching are urban poverty, political ethnography, and collective violence. He is the author of Poor People's Politics, Contentious Lives, Routine Politics and Violence in Argentina, and Patience of the State. He co-authored with Deborah Swiston, Flammable Environmental Suffering in an Argentine Shantytown, with Maria Fernanda Berti in Harm's Way, The Dynamics of Violence at the Urban Margins, and with Catherine Sobering, The Ambivalent State. He is also the editor of Invisible Austin, Life and Labor in Austin, Texas, a collaborative research project with graduate students at the UT Urban Ethnography Lab. Sharad Chari is an interdisciplinary geographer at the University of California, Berkeley. He has worked on agrarian dynamics in an industrial town in his book Fraternal Capital, published in 2004, The Remains of a Century of Racial Capitalism and Struggle in South Africa, Apartheid Remains, which is forthcoming, and co-editor with Melanie Sampson and Mark Hunter of Ethnographies of Power, which includes a stellar chapter by Zachary Levenson. He is currently working on a biographical project on queer transitions in South Africa and also on Gramsci and the Sea. And finally, Faranak Miraftab is professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. An urban scholar of globalization, she works at the intersection of sociology, geography, planning, and feminist studies, using case study and ethnographic methodologies. Her research concerns social and institutional aspects of urban development and planning that address basic human needs, including housing and urban infrastructure and services that support it. She is particularly interested in the global and local development processes and contingencies involved in the formation of the city and citizen struggles for dignified livelihood. She's author of the award-winning Global Heartland, Displaced Labor, Transnational Lives, and Local Placemaking. So as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel of speakers. I will turn it over first to Javier. And Javier, I'm going to just time you and I'll send you a message and direct message when you have about 2 minutes left, if that's okay.
Great. Thank you,
Thank
Gowri.
you.
You actually said all I wanted to say, so I can either pass it on or... But I have to admit, first, want to start admitting, but there's always a risk of offering some sort of instrumentalist reading of a book, by which I mean my reading of the book with the concerns I have now in mind in my own research. And I have to admit, I'm guilty here because my reading of this is very biased, because I'm doing research on something quite similar. So I'm going to start by just saying, why should people read this book? And the first, and in no particular order, the first reason I think this book is really amazing, it's because it's neat design. It starts with a very sort of counterintuitive, a very good puzzle, enigma, what you, Gowri, put it in terms of how are, this view of the state as a partner versus the state as an antagonistic, why eviction happens in one place and not in the other when we would expect otherwise. So that's a basic, reason why I really like the book. It hooked me. I want to read it because I want to, know to get to solve this enigma. Second, I think there's a very interesting focus on the political dimension of survival, livelihood, persistent strategies, and the focus on contentious politics as key in the forms of subsistence, but also in the ways in which the subaltern imagine a better future. And what I mean by that is that this very interesting attention that Zach is putting on all this dissolves the distinction that I think it's very present, at least in urban sociology in the United States, between making ends meet and seeking to thrive, or between, surviving and making progress. I think the case of the squatters collapses this distinction that is very much present in the literature, and also puts to rest the idea of the acquiescence of those at the margins that is still very present in the literature, at least in urban ethnography here in the United States. He relocates the source of action from the state to the subaltern, or better, the actual motor of politics lies in the relationship between state and the subaltern. And this is something I really like, because he is and I think he knows he's doing this, reflexive as he is, a very new understanding of the locus of political action, but also the factors explaining the outcomes of political action, which is something that, at least in the province where I move, the literature on outcomes of social movements, it's somewhat of a difficult issue to grapple with. In his sort of causal argument, squatting politics determines relationship with the states, determines outcomes. In his case, evictions, but we can think of particular other social policy outcomes. And this book is useful to really understand, say, I don't know, welfare programs throughout the world. This, reminds me of, Piven and Cloward, The Power of Disruptive Politics. Why I say all this? Because I think there is a conversation about poor people's hopelessness, resignations to the status quo, and this book intervenes right there. Land occupations are moved by hope, or rather by hopes in plural. Why I think this is important, and I know I'm going to offend the unreformed or the unreformed Gramscian here, but this idea of hoping to realize a democratic promise that Zach defends and articulates, I actually start thinking that these squatters are almost as Tocquevillian citizens, because they see their own welfare improvement in the improvement of their community. I know this might sound like an insult to a Gramscian, but actually I see that at least in the Cicalo case, you actually see this sort of Tocquevillian politics at play. But it's not just hoping to realize, the democratic promise. It's also hoping of autonomy through private property. And there is another virtue of this book, is that it actually shows the heterogeneity of popular politics. These hopes, and again, I'm now going to the sort of the ethnographic merits of this book, it shows up the poor people's hopes are detected, are scrutinized as they come alive, not so much in words, in Zach's case, not so much as hopes become articulate in discourse, but as they come alive in action, in organizing, in meeting, in fighting against the state, ultimately in taking over the land. The reason why I insist on this is that I always, those of us who are not working in case studies in the US, we're always asked the question, well, for those people who are not interested in South Africa or Argentina or Bolivia, what are you going to tell them that, some general lesson? And I think that even for those who are not interested in squatting, South Africa, contentious politics, or poor people's politics, readers can benefit a lot from reading this, because I think it's an exemplary way of doing political ethnography in three ways. And this comes very clearly, and I'm going to close with this one very clearly in the appendix method. One is in his very interesting distinction between epistemic and ethic reactivity. I think, Gowri, you touched on this. I think this appendix deserves to be taught, even if people don't assign the book, which I think they should in their classes. They should read the appendix as a way of doing and thinking through the way in which ethnographers or sort of where we're doing research reacts to our work. The second aspect of his political ethnography is how reflexivity should be used to understand, or to better understand, not just the researcher, or not mainly the researcher, but the object. And third, how between quotes, bias can be actually used to achieve a level of granularity that we need to understand this very difficult thing that Zach, after Gramsci, calls the common sense of the subaltern. I'm going to close with one thing, buy it, read it, teach with it, it's an amazing book. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Javier. I will turn it over now to Sharad Chari.
Thanks, Gowri. Thanks for the invitation and greetings to everyone. Sorry we can't do this in person. Zach, the most important thing in this sort of thing is to congratulate you on the feat. It's an important, engaging, beautifully written book, and I think it renews ethnography right when we need it. I'm glad Gowri pointed out the point about, your way of thinking about ethnography at a distance, rather than as ethnography as a intrusive, projection. It's really a wonderful book, and I'm also glad Gowri mentioned the notes on method at the end. I think all of it is great. So I'd like to begin with the two keywords, delivery and dispossession, delivery of housing and dispossession, and their status as concepts. And I'm going to throw out a bunch of thoughts, and you can pick up on whatever you feel is useful. So Levenson, I'll refer to the book as Levenson and you as Zach. But Levenson tells us early on that they have got that these two concepts, delivery and dispossession, have gone hand in hand, the one enabling the other. And that his task is to show us how the two concepts work together in novel ways in pre and post-apartheid periods. He goes on to ask why the apartheid state invested in the delivery side of the equation, and by equation he actually means dialectical relation, while the post-apartheid state that claims to be radical continues to dispossess people by viewing certain land occupations as disorderly and impatient. Dispossession now hastens an orderly process of post-apartheid housing delivery in the imagination of the state, as I read it. Levenson is very cautious about facile arguments about the relation between delivery and dispossession, functionalist arguments, but what is then entailed in thinking of them as a reversible logic? And is that adequate to the careful diagnosis of their changing and varied dialectics in the book? That is my first question to Zach, now properly alienated from the product of his labor. How does the notion of a reverse logic fit with the changing and varied dialectics of dispossession and housing delivery? And I'm thinking of earlier waves, including what I think is perhaps the foundational moment of state provision of housing to poor whites in the early 20th century, after systematic dispossession through war and the Great Depression. I asked us also to think about continuities in statecraft that claim to be progressive, but continue to be dispossessive. And in many ways, that is Gramsci's, the kind of a key Gramscian question. Gramscian as a thinker of nonlinear continuities and social domination, or critical renovations of prior forms. The moralizing discourse that plays a key role in relations between denizens of the two occupations and the state and the courtroom speaks to these long continuities. I realize that these are partly the questions and concerns of a non-sociologist, since the sociological contrast between the two forms of land occupation and eviction is expertly laid out in the book. The major innovation, I think, is the way in which divergent stories show us divergent forms of civil and political society articulation. It's a mouthful, but it's an important and complex argument. And I think it changes the way we read Gramsci and think with Gramsci. It's complex, important, should be widely read. I can think of no other book that actually shows this carefully what Gramsci means by posing political and civil society, not as distinct social spaces or forms of politics even, but as two aspects of a singular political struggle, the integral state. Gramsci's critique of political science, it's also, of course, a critique of sociological positivism, right, at that time. So I wonder, you might reflect on how your comparative study pushes back against the reduction of these stories to sociological cases or ideal types. It really shouldn't be read in that way. I think that the key argument is something different. Linked to this point, I wonder if you could speak a bit more about reading Gramsci with Sartre. As the book tracks denizens' shifting strategies of occupation and of judicializing resistance. It is quite a suggestive framework that you produce through reading Gramsci with Sartre, and comparing Sikkalo and Kaptein's Clip through Sartre's terms of fused and versus serial articulations of civil and political society practice. I wonder if you could speak about reading Gramsci with Sartre, both the pitfalls and opportunities. What was the decision not to stay with Gramsci's conception of the articulation of collective political will? How does the notion of fusion attend to the formation of subaltern political will? We are told that because of their anti-apartheid histories and because they could fend off representation by external civic groups, subalterns in Sikkalo maintained a resolutely antagonistic relation with respect to the state, and this helped their fusion and unity. But of course, anti-apartheid histories have also given us a post-apartheid state form racked by factionalism and state capture. So that's, certainly not adequate. I wonder if Kaptein's Clip's atomized, individuated subalterns are the norm from which the form of subaltern collective self-determination in Sikkalo must continually defend itself. And that's a different way of reading these interrelated narratives. How do you think about conditions for seriality and fusion in Gramscian terms? In other words, should we presume the ideal types hold, or that they're also contradictory and prone to breakdown? Particularly, of course, Sikkalo. In a way, the obvious debate, from my perspective, to think of it, is maybe one of the debates to think about this in relation to is Michael Burroy's sociological ideal types of despotic and hegemonic production politics, and the critiques of Marxist feminists, including Burroy's former students, about their interplay with gender regimes and in fracturing the hopes of kind of hegemonic politics in the workplace or in communities of resistance. In your case, is there an opportunity in the ethnographic comparison in this text to speak back to some of those debates from the book's normative hopes about politics of subaltern collective self-determination? I use the word subaltern in my questions, but I don't remember in the text the use of the term. It's not in the index. I wonder why it dropped out of the analysis, particularly since it is part of the black box that the Sartrean concepts, I think, are trying to address. And the politics and aesthetics of representation. I'm struck finally in the concluding theses. Zach is particularly Zach, and he helps us, drives home what he thinks are the 4 key theses we should take from this analysis. I'm struck by the second one, and I'm going to read it. Working with existing civil society organizations can be a barrier to the formation of fused groups. Autonomously articulating such organization can militate against serialization. But there's no position of political purity, is there? The text carefully engages the fraught academic and political literature on Shack-Dweller movements in South Africa to give us a new kind of perspective on the conditions that might actually produce forms of subaltern class struggle and class action. But isn't the content of civil society articulation more important to the production of political unity than whether they work with existing organizations or not? Or is the key point that the Gramscian point that critique has to take seriously the relations that exist and make them critical and new and more effective forms of articulation? To my reading, the book takes us to this possibility in a uniquely important way. I really think it's one of the it's going to be an exciting addition, not just into all sorts of domains, and certainly to our ways in which we read Gramsci and any kind of possibility of progressive politics. So Congratulations, Zach, the person. And I'm done. Gowri, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sharad, for those comments. And finally, I will turn it over to Faranak Miraftab.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel and to share my reflections on this very fine piece of research producing an important volume. Before I share my reflections on the book, I want to take a moment to recognize the brave women and men of Iran who are risking their lives and have risked their lives in the streets, bearing both pain of oppression and intensity of hope for a transformed future. We should, wherever we are, stand in solidarity with their struggle and say their names. Weeks ago, when I was reading the book and preparing my remarks, my plan was to say something about my positionality and from what political and personal position I read and reflect on Zach's book. Well, I didn't know that the book will be launched amidst such historic moment that will foreground my position in relation to South Africa's struggle for transformation and justice, as well as in Iran. In 1979 and shortly after that, with the enforcement of misogynistic capitalism in Iran, as an activist student, I witnessed how, despite our sacrifice and bravery, our revolution was hijacked and turned to something we never intended and fought for. In 1996, and shortly after, with enforcement of full-blown neoliberal policies in South Africa, I would say I witnessed how yet another set of revolutionary dreams people had sacrificed for was robbed. And as Zach puts it, how delivery became dispossession, and how a struggle against the patriarchal racial capitalism has continued on the ground and around land and housing, and through relations between a state and people. But my reflections on this volume are not only influenced by my position in broader political movements in Iran and South Africa, but also by my personal relations with protagonists of the book and their tireless organizing work for dignified life in Mitchell's Plain and Cape Flats. That is with comrades Faiza and Ibrahim, and with the late Michael Blake, to whom Zach dedicates the book. For me, this book was also a chronicle of the process by which activists like Faiza and Ibrahim were created, and also organizations and movements like Housing Assembly were shaped. So this was really an important volume in many different ways. And I congratulate you, Zach, for putting it together. Really well done. I organize my remarks around three key elements that I call it patience, hope, and care. The first one, I comment on book's methodology, articulating on the notion of radical patience. Secondly, I comment on relations between the two occupations in Captain's Cliff and Sikalo. Speaking of practice of hope and radical hope. And lastly, I will talk about, there are rich stories in the book and books within the book that could have been, and that's one comment I formulated around stories of care and radical care. So I start with the first one on methodology that is used by Zach in this fine book. Some frame it, or in the book is framed its methodology as participatory research, or some frame it as deep hanging in. I wish to speak about it as a slow knowledge that requires radical patience. Zach's work in urban studies, in particular work that is done in international context, is really a breath of fresh air. This field is populated by instant experts who do quick visits, make sweeping conclusions, and promote quick fix policies ready for off-the-shelf use across the globe. Zach's work, however, develops long-standing commitment with communities and develops root and deep relationships with them. More than a decade, it was in the making, this relationship. I use the slow food and fast food metaphor to describe the significance of this kind of work. Unlike the flyby experts who are like the fast food of policy world, slow knowledge is nutritious, flavorful, and nuanced. Like slow food, it involves patience and extensive work, consuming the time to build trust in each context. This is not an easy task. As a scholar of international development, relying on ethnographic methodology, I know too well the difficulties and challenges of grounded work. It requires trust, and trust, as Zach discusses in the book, is always fragile. It's complicated by power dynamics among academics and communities. It's an earned relationship that takes a large upfront investment in language training, cultural understanding before its rewards are received, just like the slow food. Zach's theoretical and conceptual contribution, for example, theorizing the relation between people and state in the processes of land occupation and the power of this theoretical framework, is earned through patient research and deep investigation that moves across multiple scales of analysis, from national to city to specific site of land occupation and eviction. Slow scholarship is what allows this kind of analysis. And for that, I highly recommend the book, if for nothing else, for graduate students who are grappling with questions of methodology and doing engaged scholarship. So that was my first set of comments on the methodology of the book. Second set of comments would be on understanding or making sense of the relationship between two occupations in Captain's Clip and in Zagalo. And I want to speak of hope, that these are stories of hope. So it might sound strange that how would you call it hope when it led to eviction? Delivery has been turned to dispossession. But I see the story of Captain's Clip and Zagalo also as messages of hope, not despair, even when the occupation failed in the first instance. And one struggle was oppressed, put off, and the organization and political learning, I argue, did not vanish. You know, Einstein talks about something about energy doesn't disappear, it shifts form from one to another. And in this case, I wonder if the learning, the political learning that happened in Captain's Clip kind of didn't disappear, didn't vanish, it transformed and showed up in a different place, for example, in Zagalo occupations. Could it be that folks coming to Zagalo were already seasoned in the other scholars, in the other struggles, even other failed ones? The leader, Bongenkosi, was later co-opted and swallowed in by the state apparatus, you could say, but others who came to Zagalo, according to quotes from Faiza and Faiza, were already organized and conscientized, politicized by comrades like Michael Blake, etc., and politicized prior to coming to Zagalo. So there were folks like Ibrahim and Faiza who already carried in that experience, even experience or training or politicization through the failed occupation of Captain's Clip. So could that be a way of explaining also the differences between the two occupations? So this for me is hope. Even robbed struggles of people in Iran and South Africa, where it was stolen, will they come back roaring stronger with greater maturity, as we perhaps saw in these two occupations? Hence the notion of radical hope for me. I move on to my third comment, and that's in relation to perhaps the stories that are that bear another book within the book that Zach, of fine book that Zach offers us, and that's the stories of care. We hear, there is a lot there, and if there was another way, Zach, in your next book, perhaps you go back to those stories, we could read the stories of everyday practices of care. How did those families who occupy, who did the child care? I mean, there's some mention of it, but the many things that has to be pulled together for each of these occupations to be pulled up, right? And that work that is predominantly by women and is formulated as life-making practices, feminists of social reproduction call it life-making and practices of care. That is, I think, stories that are inside these occupations that could be brought out and written for other volumes in addition to this. And then we can explain occupation in respect to their relation with the state, and as perhaps a move from care to what I articulate as radical care. Let me explain what I see as difference between, Zach theorizes it as seriality and fusion. And if we focus on those practices of care, we could perhaps see another layer that could be moving from care to radical care. How do I see the difference between these two is that one is attending the everyday need of survival, right, to exist. But the second one, the second round, you could say, there is a transformation from not only staying with what is the immediate need of shelter, of protection, of caring for your family and yourself and putting body and soul together, but moving one level up, demanding for something bigger, challenging the state for its capitalistic, racialized and policies, and challenging policy, demanding policy change. So it's not only demanding shelter for yourself as individual, but wanting something bigger. And in that sense, there is a move from a care to radical care, a move from everyday need to a challenge of hegemonic order. So if we could formulate, focusing on those practices of social reproduction and from a learnings of feminist scholarship, also talk about the relationship between these two experiences, these two occupations through that perspective. And I think again, we could have written this book in other ways, in many other ways, but the way it is written, it's put together, it has a lot to offer to scholarship in urban sociology, urban geography, and I would say even those who are articulating notion of urban, of insurgent planning and planning scholarship. Congratulations, Zach. This is a fine piece of work. And again, as I said, it has been patient work, and I enjoyed reading it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faranak, and thanks to all of you for the care you showed in your reading and in the comments that you've so generously offered. Zach, are you ready to respond? Or
Sure.
do you need a couple seconds to gather your thoughts? You okay?
Sure, as ready as I'll
Okay,
ever be.
so we will turn it over to you.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you, Gowri, for hosting this. I know no one introduced you here. And so I just wanted to also plug Gowri's book, which I'll link to in the chat, At Risk, Indian Sexual Politics in the Global AIDS Crisis. So, but I wanted to start by just thanking everybody. Faranak, Sharad, Javier, it really means the world to me. And so thank you for your rich comments. I'm not going to obviously get through all of them here. I wanted to try to sort of, I'll do a kind of run through over about 10 minutes and see what I can get to. And then we can discuss some of this stuff in the Q&A, or happy to chat about it going forward. But maybe a place to start would be with, I know Javier gave this provocative reading of a kind of Tocquevillian citizens in the book. And I think one thing that sort of troubles this reading, that these are citizens in the making, is the comparison between the two occupations. So for those who haven't read the book, when these two land occupations, both of them quite large, begin, they start in really different ways. So in one of them, this outside organization kind of postures, it's a political party front group, and it postures as if it's legitimately delivering land to people. The other occupation starts as something closer to a social movement, where a group of people self-organize and then take the land. And the reason this is really important is I think that this organization that's distributing plots, this external organization, functions closer to something like the Tocquevillian ideal type. Yet this is the occupation that winds up evicted. Whereas when people self-organize and essentially demand what they think is theirs, and then seize a piece of private property, they're ultimately tolerated. And so I think if we read all the occupiers in the book as a kind of single type, we could have that reading. But as soon as we bring in the comparative dimension, it's almost as if, I don't want to pit Gramsci versus Tocqueville and the actions of others or something like it, but it's almost as if we have the kind of Tocquevillian citizens and then the formation of something like, I don't want to call it a historic bloc in a single occupation, but something like the formation of this bloc, or we can say in shorthand, something approximating a social movement. But I think it's a really, really interesting reading. And something else Javier said that I think gets at something that Sharad brought up. I think Javier phrased it as if squatting, he said, or squatting politics could determine these eviction outcomes. And Sharad raised the question of a kind of sociological positivism here. To what extent can we take these cases and simply generalize them and ask something like, so if other land occupations were to emulate Zicalo, which wound up tolerated, would they be tolerated? And I think one thing I tried to do in the book, and I should say this narrative in the book has changed quite a bit over time. I think in earlier drafts, and going back to when it was a first draft of a dissertation, it approximated that model, where something like, if you do A, this is the outcome. If you do B, this is the outcome. And what I really shifted to over the course of all of these revisions, and really wound up completely rewriting the book, was to think more about this relational view, in which what we're looking at here, it's hard to find a point of departure and say something like, so is it how residents see the state that's, quote unquote, the ultimate cause? Well, not quite, because in the book, what I try to do is show how residents see the state is in fact shaped by how the state sees them. And so it's really, really hard to find this starting point, isolate it, and call it the proximate cause or something like it. And in the interest of simplicity and parsimony, I almost wish that I could. It made it really, really difficult to write, or as one of my dissertation committee members, Julian Hart, always puts it, writing dialectically, right? And there's always the danger that you complicate things to such an extent that it's hard to figure out where to even find a kind of point of entry to make an argument. And so one thing I tried to do here is write relationally and dialectically and think about how the two, so how people see the state and how the state sees them, are mutually co-constitutive. And I don't mean that as some kind of cop-out where we say like, all right, someone asks you, what's the cause? And you say, oh, no, they both cause each other. That's not what I'm trying to do at all here. It's simply to really reject the notion that if one is to organize in a specific way, you will get that outcome, because context absolutely matters. And so I try to show this back and forth movement between self-organization on the one hand, and what I'm calling here the state on the other, but how really the repressive apparatus of the state has shaped people's own trajectories of self-organization. And some of it is fairly contingent and not predictable or even generalizable in the traditional sense. So for example, one of the land occupations takes place, or rather the participants in this occupation, before they occupied this land, were living in an informal settlement, and many of the people in that informal settlement had a history in the anti-apartheid movement. So that becomes really, really important. It shapes their kind of history of collective struggle, the organizational forms they have at their disposal. You know, if I wanted to reduce it to sociological terms, might say the repertoire or something like it, right? But these things, the repertoire isn't given. It's shaped by their own experiential histories. And so something else that Sharad raised that I think is far more than I can answer here, and it's something I've been grappling with for a long time, is why in the world did I bring in this Sartrean analysis and kind of tack it onto Gramsci? Why not stick just with Gramsci? And a couple reasons. I mean, I should say one way that I found this Sartrean analysis, in addition to encountering critique of dialectical reason in graduate school, got really into recently the writings of the historian Jairus Banerjee, who in a lot of his earlier work is obsessed with this book, Critique of Dialectical Reason, and tries to treat it as what I think it really is, a phenomenology of struggle, but emergent struggle. So how collective struggle emerges in relation to what Sartre calls an object. And for me, it really worked insofar as we imagined that object as the state apparatus. And so how people envisioned this thing called the state, to put it in Gramscian terms, how they articulated the project of engaging the state really, really differed across the two cases. So in one case in the book, the way that people imagine the state is as a partner in delivery. So in the Kapteinsklip occupation, people see this organization that purports to be part of the state. Spoiler alert, it's not. But they think it's part of the state at the time. And it purports to be giving out these plots of land. People give little, paying registration fees, and they think it's completely legitimate. And so they see the state as a partner in delivery. Whereas in the other case, they have long histories of facing the repressive apparatus of the state. They don't see, it's almost, to put it in Bourdieu's terminology, it's as if, one occupation sees the right hand of the state and the other the left hand of the state, or something like this. But in seeing this kind of redistributive understanding of the state in one occupation, and the state as the repressive apparatus that straightforwardly evicts squatters, they wind up comporting themselves very, very differently. And so this gets back to where I started, this idea that how people envision the state, how they see the state, affects how they self-organize, which of course affects then how the state sees them. And the cycle is kind of unbroken here, right? Because then how the state sees them affects how they subsequently organize, which gets to a really important point that Faranak introduced here. And I think there's something that Faranak said that reminded me of something that Sharad said, that Sharad questioned the notion of having a kind of positivist account that fixates on two self-enclosed cases that are worlds unto themselves, right? So we have my occupation 1, case 1, occupation 2, case 2, and these are separate, really mutually exclusive worlds. And Faranak pointed to the relationship between these two occupations, the extent to which, as much as we might read, say, the eviction in Kapteinsklip as a story of despair, interestingly, she reads it as a story of hope. Why? Well, so many of the strategies that are forged in Sitkalo, the second occupation, emerge from this first occupation. And as it turns out, participants who are evicted from Kapteinsklip wind up going over to Sitkalo. So, it would be, absolutely what's not going on here is that these are just sort of two distinct cases that never come into contact, because quite literally, people walk from one occupation after they're evicted and join the other. And I think it gets at, I know I've already referenced her once, but I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of what Gillian Hart calls relational comparison. And I didn't, when I first framed this comparison, I think I hadn't published the most recent articles at the very least on relational comparison, but thinking about, I often like to think of Hart's idea of relational comparison as almost relationality against comparison, the extent to which putting two cases in relation to each other explodes the caseness of the cases. And so I try to, I don't know that I go that far in the book. I think I try to not to represent it as an extremist position or something, but simply to say, I think what I try to do is to maintain the caseness of the cases so that I have this comparison between them, but also showing how they're not self-enclosed worlds and how what happens and emerges from one occupation winds up impacting the other one. And I think, because of the strictures of the publishing industry, I'm limited in word count, and I would have really loved to include some of the stuff that Faranak was talking about on questions of care here. And I should mention that, I like that you referenced social reproduction theory here. I mean, thinking about almost different trajectories of questions of social reproduction. And I think there's, thankfully now, well, not now, I mean, at least since the mid-1980s, really, really important lineage of feminist theorizing coming out of South Africa. But then there's an earlier understanding of reproduction. So figures like Harold Wolpe or Martin Legasek, thinking about questions of social reproduction, not in gendered ways and not tied to the family as such, but just sort of limited to peasant production or something like it. And something that emerges here is the very much gendered notion of or the gendered kind of articulation, I think, of social reproduction. Where what we have here, as Faranak rightly points out, is in both occupations, almost all of the social reproduction work and the organizing work, insofar as we understand it as social reproduction work, is being carried out by women. I mean, really, really interesting part of this story is that, and this isn't exclusive or kind of exceptional to these two occupations. This is something that I found in nearly all land occupations I encountered in Cape Town. And, I can think of a couple of exceptions, but in almost all of the occupations, it was women doing this kind of organizing work. And there are a couple reasons as to why. This notion of hope, I think, that Faranak brings up is very much a gendered one insofar as it was expressed to me in the very first interviews I did. When I asked people, so why are you participating in an occupation? And let me put it this way, that people were participating in an occupation, but already, an occupation is quite precarious by definition. People don't know that even if they're to build their own shack, that shack's going to remain standing 24 hours later. For all they know, the police and the anti-land invasion unit, an organization I describe in the book that's part of the city's housing department, can have them removed within 24 hours. But many of these people were already living in shacks, in backyards, or in informal settlements. So why move from what would seem to be a more secure shack arrangement to something where you can face eviction on a daily basis? And usually this is where hope comes in. Typically, this was articulated to me as having a home of one's own. And it was really interesting because it wasn't quite articulated in the kind of proprietarian language of becoming a homeowner, or it was less about that and more about dignity, more about having a place that they can call their own, not about owning the thing, but about not being dependent on another. So in the case of a backyard shack, which is a quite common arrangement in Mitchell's Plain, actually more common than living in an informal settlement in quite a few townships, you wind up with people who are dependent upon the homeowner. They're living in a shack behind a formal house, and then maybe they have to pay rent to that homeowner, or even if they don't, they have to ask every time they want to use their bathroom. They're worried that their kids may view them as, as insufficient providers, something like this. And so there's something about dignity and autonomy that's articulated through the project of land occupation. And I think it takes on a very much gendered guise insofar as many of these are female-headed households. And so often it was articulated to me as providing for one's children or one's family. And so it wasn't what I expected when I went in to see this narrative in terms of autonomy or dignity. But it's absolutely what I encountered most frequently. So there's a lot more here. Maybe I should sort of wrap it up, and I've been talking for a while, and open it up for discussion. But I really wanted to thank all three of you for these comments. Really generative, generous, and it means a whole lot to me. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have about 30 minutes, and thanks to you all for being really good about staying to time. So we actually have a good amount of time for discussion. So what I'll ask is that if you have a question, if you can use the raise hand function on Zoom. If you feel more comfortable, you could also put your question into the chat. I'll see if there are any questions right away. While people are thinking, I can just throw a couple into the mix. Oh, okay, I see a question from, is it Simeon?
Yeah, thanks, Gowri. Thanks, Zach, for a really interesting book. My question is, I think it's kind of conceptual. You are careful to distance yourself from what you characterize as a resource mobilization view, which I take you to mean just like basically a kind of instrumentalist view of let's make demands, let's press on, sort of government officials and wrest concessions. Like that's very much like not what you want to do in the text. And you mentioned numerous times that that occupiers were actually trying to evade government detection and just settle a space without any of that sort of that kind of an orientation, a kind of claims making type orientation. And yet sometimes you do point to that there were, in fact, you even right when you're culminating, you talk about how different land occupations were vying with one another over access to state resources. And so I guess the question then is is it a sort of de facto vying, or maybe not de facto, but maybe accidentally vying for state resources, even if it's not a kind of rational actor saying, if we behave in this way, then we're likely to wrest concessions of this kind of a thing. But nevertheless, that they're as a matter of fact, kind of making those kinds of claims on sort of political society. So that's I guess my main question. And so the second question is about factionalism in the respective settlements, and so I wondered what you would think of a sort of alternative explanation, which would be, so your argument is that, well, you would think factionalism would lead to weakness and therefore eviction, right? Wait, maybe I got that backwards. Actually, so unity would lead to concessions, which would lead the state presumably to hit back or something like that. But there's a way in which also thinking about what the government needs actually for its own political projects, that unity actually would be potentially a positive thing. In other words, factionalism wouldn't provide the kind of support that government officials could benefit from, because it's just infighting and nobody can get behind a government project if it's infighting. And therefore, well, let's get these people out of the way because they're neither here nor there kind of thing. So I wonder what you would think of that alternative type of an explanation. Thanks.
Great. No, great set of questions. I think, starting with the critique of the resource mobilization approach, I think you kind of nailed it when you I think you used the phrase unintended consequence, but that yes, one way to look at this is that people are vying for resources, and whoever is most effective in gaining those resources winds up obtaining the resources. But I think the way that most participants in land occupations view this is not as trying to ask for a resource, right? I mean, they're actively appropriating these resources through occupation. And so there's never really an attempt to ask or even acquire resources from the state as such. Largely, it's something that happens later on, where people occupy land and then, unfortunately for them, are faced with the state, right? But this idea that they wind up having to engage the state, but they don't deliberately target the state when they begin, or they're not actively competing. So while I do describe them as competing for scarce resources, given that housing is inherently limited in this context, they're certainly not, they don't view themselves as in competition in this sort of way, with the exception of within one of the occupations where they do become competitive, which then produces factionalism. Now, when it comes to the question of factionalism, I think you're absolutely right that this unity, or what in the book I call the fused group, is productive for the state. It becomes the population that the state can, quote unquote, see. But it's not people's intention to form that kind of population. The reason that they achieve unity is precisely because they, well, in the beginning, want to evade the state, and then they wind up, once they find themselves on the terrain of the state, they want to push back against that state or defend the occupation. And so they wind up unifying in that sense. But it was quite antagonistic. I mean, one thing that was really surprising to me about this outcome is that we're talking about a unified occupation that led mass marches, that fought with the police, that when the, I think I described this in one part of the book, when the organization that registers voters set up a tent on the road next to the occupation, occupiers came and set it on fire because they saw it as a symbol of the state. So it's certainly not this kind of docile population, but something more like a militant, quite militant social movement, so to speak. It only becomes something like a social movement once state agents start appearing, and then they have to engage the state. So at the beginning, they're trying to evade the thing, but it's a story of unintended consequences in that sense. That what absolutely, I think it's logical. I think the way you laid it out is quite right. But I don't think when it comes to intentions, that's why people are unifying in that sort of way, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. So I see questions from Jed Schwartz and Ben Bradlow, and maybe we will take those two questions together and then ask Zach to answer them together. Jed, would you like to go first?
Yeah, you can hear me okay? Yeah, yes. Okay, so I ordered the book like 5 minutes ago. And I had a couple of questions. One was, what was the venue? Were you like moving from shack to shack in these areas, or were there any central locations like in pubs? Are there pubs in these areas? I mean, what was the context in which you were interacting with these people? Then how extensive is media coverage, especially television media, in South Africa? What has been the role of the news media in depicting these kinds of struggles? And there was another question I had, which I've lost the I've lost it. But apparently, you're saying that the protesters were to a certain extent feared by the state. Would you say that that's a accurate take on your presentation? And I'll leave it at that. I mean, I had more questions, but I haven't read the book, obviously. Go ahead.
Sure. No. Great question. Thanks. And yeah, so quickly, maybe in reverse order. I don't think people were feared at all by the state. I mean, that's what's so interesting here is it's a fairly routinized kind of interaction with the state, where the City of Cape Town's Department of Human Settlements, their housing department, has this arm called the Anti-Land Invasion Unit that's tasked with going around and monitoring new occupations. And it's never a question of fear per se, because these aren't particularly rare occurrences. I mean, this gets to the question of media coverage. In fact, these are so common, new occupations, that they're rarely covered by the media. So most media sources, and I should say that there are instances where there are fierce clashes between police and land occupiers that do make the newspaper, but it's really, really hard to trace new land occupations on the basis of TV and newspaper coverage. It's a little easier once you start looking at community newspapers and such. And there are a few high-profile occupations that absolutely obtain media coverage. But we have to understand here that maybe in a US context, informal housing is quite rare. And we might imagine, even in a city where it's not considered rare, we're often talking about thousands or even tens of thousands of people living in tents. But in the case of South African cities, and the data on this isn't great, but by our best estimates, somewhere between 15 and 25% of the urban population are living in informal housing. If those shacks are built in emergent settlements, we have to ask, where did they come from? Well, in most cases, that's what a land occupation is. I think it's really interesting that in a lot of the literature on self-built housing, there's quite a bit of work on already established informal settlements, but very little on the genesis and emergence of these settlements in the first place. And so I understand a land occupation as the emergence of an informal settlement in the first place and try to capture that moment, but it's hard because if I were to sit back and say, read the Cape Times every day in Cape Town, maybe twice a year I'll get some description of a land occupation after the fact, but then it's already too late because it's already happened. As for research site, I talk quite a bit about this in the book and the methodological afterward, but one problem with simply moving in to a land occupation driven by factions is that if I were to stay with someone who's associated with one faction, no one in another faction is going to talk to me. And so I had to tread very carefully. And so often I stayed outside an occupation and then would visit constantly, but often I would interview people from the occupations off-site so as to not appear partisan, so to speak. But at the same time, some of this is inevitable. They might be large occupations, but even with a few thousand people, word gets around. And so it was evident that, I talked to some people and not others. And even if I tried to talk to everyone, where the occupations took place is it's in the second largest township in Cape Town, Mitchell's Plain, which is quite large. And just to give a description here, I don't want people thinking that Mitchell's Plain is like just one giant shack settlement or something. Absolutely not, right? This thing emerges, Mitchell's Plain, in the 1970s, and I talk about this in chapter 2 of the book. People often think of apartheid as some ancient thing that started in 1948. But what's really interesting about Cape Town is the two largest informal settlements, the two largest townships, Mitchell's Plain and Khayelitsha, were built in the late 70s and early 80s, respectively. I mean, that's how recent they are. So if we think about the relationship between delivery and dispossession, that people are forcibly, and not just people, but racialized populations, so-called colored in the case of parts of Cape Town, Xhosa-speaking Black Africans and other parts are forcibly evicted, they're dispossessed, but where are they moved to? Well, the apartheid state builds new townships and forcibly forcibly relocates them there, largely into small formal houses. And so you wind up pretty quickly with a situation of overcrowding once they don't provide additional housing and new generations emerge. And then in the interstices, those who are living in these overcrowded homes wind up occupying land, or else they might move into a backyard shack. So you really have this kind of interstitial setup with formal houses, but then open fields that are then sites of land occupations or informal settlements, but really side by side. So absolutely, there's grocery stores, there's all the shopping malls. There's people in the case of Sitralo, there's people selling stuff on the side of the street right next to it. The next shop over is a sandwich shop. There's a candy shop back there. So yeah, I mean, it's not like this is in the middle of nowhere. This is on the Cape Flats, where 60% of the population of Cape Town actually lives.
Ben?
Yeah, so Zach, congratulations. I've read the book and I echo all of the compliments that other people have made. And just because you mentioned the mechanics of occupation in your last comment, I just wanted to underscore for others that this, I think it's probably one of the most detailed accounts and most detailed analytical account of informal settlement occupation dynamics that I've ever read. I wanted to ask you, a lot of the theoretical approach here is about a relational account of the state. And I wanted to ask your reflections on disaggregating the particular parts of the state that you're looking at, because delivery is kind of the bureaucratic context for the whole story. That is the fact that there's a specific set of policies and a specific kind of bureaucratic apparatus for housing delivery becomes the basis for people getting frustrated by the waiting list for housing and moving out, kind of wanting to fly under the radar in order to occupy. But the parts of the state that are most present in your account are not the delivery apparatus, even when you're talking about the housing department in Cape Town or the human settlements department. What you're looking at is an apparatus for security, punishment, a judicial apparatus, and ultimately an apparatus of dispossession. This is kind of like the main part of the state that you're looking at. Leads me to wonder how you would analyze, or how would you explain that this becomes inevitable, that so much of the terrain of the state that is engaged by these movements is about punishment and legal bureaucracy. And actually the apparatus for delivery features very minimally in the kind of interaction that these groups are having with the state.
Great question. I was thinking about this in relation to Javier's book, Patience of the State, and this question, this concept of waiting figures prominently in the book, but you're right that it falls into the background. I think part of the reason here is when we think about, so what Ben is referencing here is this housing waiting list. If you think about after apartheid, and I talk about this in the book, after apartheid, the government delivers something in the neighborhood of 4 million homes, formal houses to people. But they have to enter this waiting list to get these homes. And while initially it starts, being on the waiting list a few years, pretty soon there's such a backlog of people in need of housing that right now the Socioeconomic Rights Institute in Johannesburg estimates the average time waiting in Cape Town is 60 years, 60, whereas that's just marginally below the average life expectancy in South Africa. So when you register for the housing waiting list, you quite literally go to a local office, fill out a form, and then you're on the list. And then there's this online demand database, and you can occasionally check. But that's sort of it insofar as interaction with the state, so to speak, or this aspect of the state, the essentially the welfare state, or the redistributive state. There's very little in the way of a constant interaction. And so when you think about who it is that people are interacting with on a daily basis, what happens is as people grow frustrated with being on the waiting list for so long and never actually having any hope of gaining housing, and then they might see their neighbors get housing and wonder, wait, we registered at the same time, why did they get housing and not me? Something like this. They then occupy land, and it's not as if then representatives of the waiting list part of the state come and interface with them. They actually never see those people. And so what's so interesting here, and I think Ben really puts his finger on it, is that the people they are interacting with on a regular basis, so representatives of the anti-land invasion unit who are tasked with monitoring these occupations, they can't legally evict them, and so they work with the police. So you have the South African Police Service. So these two in particular, but then judges and people find themselves consistently in a courtroom. And so a large part of the book, especially I think the last two ethnographic chapters, are about a different sort of waiting, the interminable experience of having to go from one courtroom to the next, to have to travel by taxi all the way downtown to get to court date that might not actually happen, and going one after another. So they're interacting with people that are from that arm of the state. If we think about judges, police, the anti-land invasion unit, that's who they're interacting with on a daily basis. And it's why I think, it absolutely shapes how they see the state, how land occupiers see the state. Because then when you have people from, say, neither of those two arms, let's say the state has many arms, right? So think about, I used the example before of the Electoral Commission coming and registering people to vote, and they set the thing on fire. Why? Well, they have this repressive apparatus of the state standing in, their experience in interacting with the repressive apparatus stands in for the entirety of the state. And so therefore, any kind of aspect of the state becomes repressive. And so there's a pretty extreme skepticism of the housing waiting list, even that it exists, something like it. Government workers coming and cleaning toilets, this sort of thing. So people who we might associate with the welfare arm of the state or the redistributive arm of the state instead of the repressive apparatus come to be seen as still part of the repressive apparatus, because this is overwhelmingly who people are interacting with at the level of everyday experience. And I think it's really, frustrating. And it's not that I'm sympathetic, but I should say it's absolutely frustrating for housing officials then, who don't understand why they're seen as, to put it bluntly, enemies, or kind of why they get tied to the repressive apparatus of the state in this way, because they see themselves as overseeing this delivery apparatus, not the dispossessive apparatus. Yet the entirety of the state comes to be seen as repressive, because that's people's experience, other than going to some office once, filling out a C form and calling it a day. So I think that's a real problem in this context. I mean, it's something that, insofar as there's a policy implication here, I think something about people's everyday experience needs to be taken into account, that they don't view the state as a partner in delivery. And when they do, there's no way to really trust it, right? So one of these occupations, Kapteinsklip, they thought the state was a partner in delivery, and yet it turns out it wasn't even the state. It was a front group acting as if they were distributing houses. And so in that case, people sort of got duped. But all this is to say, I think they wind up seeing the entirety of the state as a repressive apparatus.
So I see we have 3 questions, so I'll just have all 3 people ask their questions. We only have about 5 minutes left together, and then Zach, maybe you can try to address whatever you have time to address in those questions. Annie?
Okay, I want to be mindful of time as well, but echoing everyone, many congrats, Zach. It's been awesome following your work over the years, and I've now read every page of this book, so I can also say everyone should please read all of it and appreciate it theoretically and methodologically. Again, I have so many things to say, but maybe I'll just choose one of them because it hinges off the last comment about the housing authorities. One thing I like about the book is that you write it in a way where you can hear how frustrated you are in tone a lot of times when it comes to kind of talking with these housing authorities. In particular, you talk about how they perceive a lot of the squatters as queue jumpers. They're not rationally waiting in line, and they're just therefore disrupting the democratic project. And what's insane is that you and probably the rest of us urban sociologists can say, well, of course they're doing this. They don't have other homes, and this totally like eludes the housing authorities for some reason because they're so dedicated to the notion of the post-apartheid democratic project. And so I was wondering if you ever, in talking with them during or after, did you, pose that reality? Like the reason they're here is because they simply don't have housing. How do they further justify not seeing that? And kind of to go off for Faranam's point, I mean, you did an amazing process of sort of like slow food research. Do you have any intent on sort of going back to the policy people and saying, hey, this is what I've found, maybe consider this as well? Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. Christopher?
Hey, everybody. Congrats, Zach. Thanks again. Good to see you. I have kind of a sort of odd question that might not really fit into this general framework, but as you're speaking about the idea that the state is sort of viewed, even the housing authority, even people sort of trying to do good are viewed sort of negatively because of the other apparatuses of the state. I don't remember, it's been maybe a year since I've read, but what are there any other third parties? I mean, is there another opportunity here for, I would never be one to recommend capital as the way to help this, but is there anything for private industry or something that could be providing housing, and how would that, is there a way you can maybe speak to how that might relate to a way of dealing with, if the state, even the housing authority is viewed as with the oppressive arm of the state as well, is there some other way for this, for some other opportunity for housing to be supplied that is unrelated to the oppressive arm of the state? Just a kind of a thought that I had as I heard discussion continue.
Great, thank you. So maybe because we only have 2 minutes, Jed, if you could, maybe we could stick around for a little 5 more minutes, but have Zach answer those 2 questions first.
Sure, and I'll try to be really quick if that's no, that's a great question, Annie, right? Like how would housing officials respond in this context? And I think some of it has to do with the positionality of the bureaucrat, right? That me providing this kind of knowledge is not news. It's essentially what they deal with every day. And so the problem is that target populations wind up being 2 things at once. On the one hand, there's recipients of government housing, and so those who the Department of Human Settlements is working to target. But at the same time, then there are land occupiers who wind up in housing officials' eyes interfering with the project of delivery. As it turns out, those 2 people are those 2 groups of people are one and the same. Those who are waiting for housing patiently are also occupying land which appears impatient from the perspective of housing officials. And so, yes, I've absolutely put it straightforwardly, including I interviewed a number of, including the head of the anti-land invasion unit, and sat down with them for hours. Got a tour of the facilities, and really, really interesting. But they also, what's most interesting to me is they don't tend to know the details of these cases, even when they're going on a regular basis. So there's this kind of assumption going in, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, I don't want to ramble too much, but but that there's this assumption that the reason that people are occupying land is to get formal government housing, instead of the reason people are occupying land is because they've given up on the possibility of getting government housing. Now, it's never a full renunciation of that wish or that hope, right? I mean, I think Faranak is right to say that occupations still retain a kind of an element of hope. And part of that is, yeah, maybe you will get housing down the line, but it's absolutely not the primary reason people are occupying land, even if that's how housing officials understand it. And so the most frustrating engagement I had, and I should mention, this wasn't just interviews. I went to housing policy workshops on a regular basis. I even participated as a kind of, I don't know, an academic sitting in on City of Cape Town housing workshops in the actual Department of Human Settlements offices, and was consistently sort of taken aback at this kind of, well, to put it in the language of the book, the way that the state sees, the way that these were seen as populations, but operating in a context of material scarcity. There are only so many houses to go around. And so then there are calculations on the part of housing officials, you know, which inevitably take on a moralistic guise, hence terms like queue jumpers. So who do we give housing to and who don't we give housing to? Because you have to order the distribution in that kind of way. And how do they do it? On moralizing grounds. It turns out these moralizing categories don't really bear any relation to reality because they separate them into two categories, the impatient and the patient, but they're the same people. So all this is to say, yes, really, really frustrating. And I find it hard to give policy recommendations here. And, you know, I could do my whole Bourdieusian spiel about why I don't do policy recommendations. There's a great version of this, the last chapter of Javier's book with Katie Sobering, The Ambivalent State, that gets at just this. But let me give a different answer, which is to say that I don't know that housing policy can be effective in this context. When you look at what the distribution of free formal housing does, on the one hand, we could say it's great, people access housing. On the other hand, it's delivered to them where they're already living, which means it's essentially rendering the spatial geography, you know, the racialized geography of apartheid permanent. And so you have to ask, how could it be otherwise? Well, another way to ask that question is to ask, why are they not building housing for people who are dispossessed under apartheid closer to the city center or in areas where they'd actually want to live that are lower crime, or, you know, and it may be the case that that's a poor characterization and that people have established communities and they don't want to move. But there are plenty of cases where they also do. And so when I'd ask about this, it turns out there's an arm of the housing department called that oversees what's called land banking. And so the city buys up a bunch of land and then uses this to build new housing projects. This gets at what Chris raised, which is like, so how do you do this? And part of the problem is land near, you know, that's proximal to the city center is expensive, and so they don't buy it. And so what winds up happening is all these new housing projects that are built, whether it's freestanding homes, whether it's social housing, winds up being further and further on the periphery, or at the very least, where people have already been peripheralized forcibly through dispossession, apartheid era dispossession. You know, whether, you know, the question of private sector or any other potential fixes here, I mean, it's a problem because it's not as if the only game in town are these free formal houses. So to qualify for those, you have to be at a certain income level. Then if you make more than that, but less than the amount you need to qualify for a mortgage, or what they tend to there call bond houses, you qualify for social housing. But that's based on income. But in this section of Mitchell's Plain, the real unemployment rate is something like 65%. So even if on paper we're looking at 35, 40%, in reality, you're looking at 65, maybe even 70%. So they're not going to qualify for that. There are now partnerships between the housing delivery and the private sector where the government then contracts. But then the problem is they build on the cheap, which is why in Cape Town, something like 60% of delivered homes have been marked as deficient in some way. Some of them are even crumbling and need to have been earmarked for demolition, something like a quarter of them. So, you know, really, really difficult engagement, I think, with the private sector here.
So we are out of time. Thank you so much to Faranak, to Sharad, to Javier for your brilliant comments. And thank you to Zach for your brilliant book, and to all of you for these wonderful questions. It's been so nice to have this conversation, and I can tell there's lots more to talk about. And I think Zach can stay around for a little longer. Is that right? So if people have additional questions or just want to continue the conversation, we can just keep the Zoom room open to you. To everyone else, have a wonderful rest of your day and a great weekend. Thank you for being here.
Thank you again, Zach. Great work. And thank you, Gowri.
No, thank you. And thanks so much for coming.
Take care.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Gowri, for organizing.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, Zach.
Hey.
Come on.